but there's a great deal more that I think you guys should know about him, because he does a whole lot more than studying bees in urban and their sensitivity to urban warming. He's currently an associate professor and co-director of the Center for Watershed and Great Lakes Studies and the Department of Biological Sciences at Bowling Green State University, where he's a specialist in ecology. Previously, he received his PhD at Arizona State University, where he studied the influence of rivers drying on streamside animals, where he found that animal water balance was extremely important in understanding streamside food webs. Subsequent work since coming to Bowling Green has been focused on various aspects of global change in both aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems. This work also involves current projects on investigations of the climate sensitivity of urban bees, tonight's topic. But he also has research on examining the effects of wastewater chemicals on streams and streamside food webs, using isotopes to trace nutrient sources in waterways and to examine soil health. Kevin works extensively in wetlands, where he examines the roles of plants and animals in wetland nutrient cycling and investigates factors influencing freshwater crustaceans in wetlands across the Great Plains. So I'm going to stop yakking and let Kevin take the helm here, where he's going to tell us, again, the title, Sweating the Bees, Sensitivity to Urban Warming.
Thank you, Helen. Thanks for that nice introduction. So yeah, so the title sort of gives a hint at what this is going to be about. And we're talking about bees and their sensitivity to urban warming. So there we go. So why should we care about bees? Well, the pollination of crops by bees is worth at least $24 billion per year in the US alone. So that's quite a lot, right? What are we talking about? Well, this is a sort of graphic representation of, if we lost the bees, what would your grocery section look like? Might look like this: a lot of empty shelves, right? Lots of things missing. And that's because bees provide a lot of services for producing lots of different crops, right? So this can include honey. Obviously, people think about honeybees and their production of honey, but also it's really important for other things we might care about, like tea and spices, dairy. And the reason for that is because bees are important pollinators of what the cows eat. Almonds, which you've probably heard about, or you may have heard about the importance of bees for almond production in California. Oil seeds, coffee. I have a statistic about coffee I'll give you later. Hamburgers, again, back to what are the cows eating, and chocolate. So I think a lot of us like chocolate and would be sad if it was either gone or more expensive, which it'd probably be more expensive. So a lot of people think honeybees when they think bees, maybe not this crowd, but a lot of people do. Honeybees are important for food production. That's very true. But there are many other bees. Just how many? Well, worldwide, there's 20,000 species of bees. And there's 4,000 just in the US and 500 just in Ohio. So there's a really massive amount of bee diversity that most people don't realize. What are some Ohio wild bees that we might think about? Leafcutter bees, and yes, they can cut leaves and use them to build nests, but they also pollinate crops. Longhorn bees, this one doesn't have particularly a long antenna, but they're named for their particularly long antenna in the males. Bumblebees, which I'm sure all of you have seen and many of you might appreciate. Carpenter bees, which the large ones can sometimes be confused with bumblebees, but they're a little less hairy on their abdomen, so that's a good way to tell them apart. But there's also these teeny tiny carpenter bees that you might not even think of as carpenter bees, so there's a lot of variation there. And then sweat bees. Sweat bees are a huge group of bees, tons and tons of diversity. But there's just two examples, and you can see there's some really colorful, beautiful sweat bees. Mining bees, they have kind of a lot of pollen on their legs because they have these really big leg hairs. That's kind of a good way to see them, tell them apart. Mason bees, and finally squash bees, which actually specialize on squash, and so they're active only first thing in the morning when squash blossoms are open. So this is just a few of the wild bees you might find in Ohio. If you want to find out more, I recommend going to this website, the Ohio State University Extension website that has a Ohio Bee Identification Guide. So wild bees are important. We talked about, we talked about bees in general and how they are important for pollination, but wild bees especially are important. People may not realize how important they are compared to honeybees. And this is a paper just showing that wild pollinators enhance the fruit set of crops regardless of honeybee abundance. So even if there's honeybees there already, adding in wild pollinators leads to even more pollination of crops. And sort of related to that is this idea that more species of bees equals more seeds produced by the plants, more fruit and more seeds produced by the plants. And so this is from a paper where they showed this. So without bees, humans can pollinate by hand. It's kind of wild to think about doing that, but some people do, or by drone. But using humans or drones to pollinate costs about 65 times more than using honeybees. This particular study was about honeybees, but you could also say the same thing of many of our wild bees. So sort of to summarize some of the importance of bees and other pollinators, some plants require animal pollination. So there's some that we would lose entirely if we didn't have the bees. Others don't require it, but it does help. So what do I mean by it helps? I'll get into that in a second. But more bees and more species equals more and better quality fruit. So if you have more different species of bees, or you just have a greater abundance of bees, you get more and better quality fruit. So with losing bees, food becomes harder to produce, poorer quality, and more expensive. So it includes berries, coffee, chocolate, apples, pears, pumpkin, avocado, onions, cucumber, cabbage, almonds, many oils, dairy, and beef, and clothing because of cotton. This is a statistic I like to mention. Coffee might double in cost without bees. So imagine, you go get a cup of coffee, it might cost maybe $5 right now, might cost $10 without bees. So puts it in perspective for a lot of us. And of course, the conservation value. I think that the people here in this group understand that we might want to care about bees just because we care about conservation of species. We don't want to lose species unnecessarily. So that's a little bit about why bees are important. What dangers do bees face? So there's some pretty ones that you've probably heard of before, like habitat loss, pesticides, and diseases and parasites. So these are sort of commonly known to have negative effects on wild bees and honeybees for that matter as well. What about climate change? So this topic has received a little bit less attention. So I'm going to focus in on for the rest of my talk on this because I've done some work in this area. So first, I'll just mention briefly global climate change, right? So I'm not going to go into the background of what causes it and all of that right now, but how does it affect bees? Well, there's a paper that came out not too long ago showing that climate change contributes to widespread declines among bumblebees in particular. And you're gonna probably see that trend in my data too. So this is sort of, bumblebees in particular are known to be kind of more sensitive to climate change. But this is global climate change they're talking about here. What about local climate change? Some of you might be familiar with the concept of the urban heat island. And so this is sort of, a diagram of like a cross section of a city, right? So you have the really urbanized downtown, lots of big buildings, lots of pavement, right? And then as you go farther out, you might get into suburban areas or rural or even some natural areas, right? And then behind that, what you can see, this red is kind of a graph of the late afternoon temperature and the temperature you might expect in the different parts of the city. And so it tends to go up in the more urbanized parts of the city. Why? Well, because of pavement. So basically you get, if you have a parking lot like this, or some parking lots are even darker, like black, right? They can absorb a lot of solar radiation and re-radiate that back out. And so they can get very hot and heat up not only the surfaces, but the surrounding air as well. This is a map of the city. This is from Raleigh, North Carolina. So this is a map of Raleigh, of the city of Raleigh. And it's a map showing the temperatures on the, what it might feel like on the skin temperature. And you can see that there's a lot of variation in temperatures. So this is in Celsius, so that makes it a little harder. But some of the dark red areas could be in the range of like 32, 33 to 45 degrees Celsius surface temperature. That's quite hot, okay? We're talking well above 90 degrees up to into the hundreds. And then other parts of the city you can see are in this blue range, a lot cooler, like 10 degrees Celsius cooler. That's the same time, right? Same exact moment. Different parts of the city can have very different temperatures. And we see that in Toledo as well. This is actually air temperature. This is not surface temperature. But what we can see is that with greater amounts of impervious surface, so that pavement that we're talking about, we see an increase in the average temperature at a site. Okay, so even in Toledo, we see this pattern. But urban gardens could help with food deserts. So I don't know if any of you have heard about this concept of food deserts where, oh, that little red box is in the wrong place, but distance to the nearest grocery store is what this map is showing. And this is in Detroit. And you can see some areas, including like downtown Detroit. You have to go greater than 3 miles to get to a grocery store. And so if you don't have really good transportation, you might have trouble accessing fresh fruits and vegetables. So that's this idea of the food desert. But there's been a kind of an idea that, hey, if we create more urban gardens, and that could help alleviate those issues, right? Give people access to fresh fruit and produce in even very urbanized locations. But now we also know that those locations are much warmer, right? A lot hotter. So what are the risks of urban warming to bees in these urban gardens? So that was kind of a key question that we had. And so essentially, what are the effects on bees if you're in a little garden, a little urban garden like this surrounded by pavement? So I'm going to start with some research done by my previous PhD student, Justin Burdine. He's now a professor at Cornerstone University in Michigan. And for his PhD, he asked this question: how does the risk of overheating and desiccation, so dehydration or drying out, vary among bees across a city, and really focused in on parks within that city? What city? He did focus on Toledo for his work. And I want to point out that Toledo is a cool, moist city. If you look over on the left, you can see mean annual temperature, and it's not in the hotter parts of the country, obviously, right? Mean annual precipitation, it's also pretty mild. We get quite a lot of rainfall, right? So a cool, moist city. You might not expect the bees to be a particular risk. He examined this across a gradient of impervious surface. So this is a map of Toledo, Ohio. This is not the temperature of the surfaces, but the redder parts are places with lots of pavement, okay? Lots of parking lots and roads, for instance. And so we know that that increases temperatures. So then if he looked at all these different locations, this different impervious surface, we might be able to see whether that was affecting the bees. So for his work, we just focused on 3 species. We focused on the eastern bumblebee, Bombus impatiens, the western honeybee, Apis mellifera, and the silky striped sweat bee, Agapostemon sericus. Okay, so as I mentioned, he focused on gardens and parks. And so you can see some of the pictures of some of the sites where he did this research. Perhaps some of them are familiar. What did he do? What did he measure? Well, first I'm going to give you some background. So when we talk about bees, we often think of, well, when we talk about any organism that gets its energy from the environment, or its heat from the environment, I should say, we can think about something called a thermal performance curve. What is that? Well, if you can think about it, if you have an animal that's really, really cold, right, it's not going to do very well. It might not even be able to move if it's something like a bee that gets its heat from the environment. And so this is performance. So it's not going to do very well if it's really cold. As it warms up, it's going to do better and better. If it's a bee, it's going to be able to get back to its nest or hive and provision it. And so at some point, there's going to be an optimum temperature, some temperature at which the bee does the best. But then if it gets a little too hot beyond that, suddenly the bees do much worse, or any organism that gets its energy from the environment will do much worse until they reach something called the CT max. That's the critical thermal maximum. So that's the maximum temperature at which an animal can survive. At that point, they're basically dead. And so this is a typical thermal performance curve. This is what they often look like. So the first thing he did was he measured the CT max. And then I'm going to add another curve. And this is something that hasn't really been investigated by others before. This is something that my lab has been sort of developing, this hypothetical Heiger performance curve. So this was about temperature. This is about water over here on the right. So body water content is what we're talking about. And in this case, it's kind of like a little bit reversed. So yeah, maybe you could be overhydrated over here. So this is body water content. So this is a bee that has too much water in it. But for most organisms, most of the time, that doesn't usually happen. But then there's going to be some kind of optimal hydration, okay, that is good for you. And then as you dry out, you're going to have lower and lower performance. And we know from a lot of work that's been done that this decline is usually pretty rapid. As you get dehydrated, you start to do much more poorly, much more quickly, especially for humans, but even if you're a bee. And then at some point, you're going to reach the point where you just die. And that's what we're calling our critical water content minimum. So minimum critical water content. So that's the limit at which you dehydrate to death, essentially. So he measured these in the lab. He took a limited number of bees from sites and measured the maximum temperature the bees could tolerate and the minimum water content that they can tolerate. So that's part of understanding what he did here to look at the sensitivity of the bees. But there's another important part, and that is measuring what the actual body temperatures of the bees were in the field. So that's this part right here. So here's its maximum. This might be a temperature of an individual bee that we collected at one particular site at one particular time, okay? Well, we could also do the same thing for water content. We can determine actually how much water is in the body of a bee collected at a particular site at a particular time. And we might find a value like this, right near its optimum. So he went out and did this. This is a diagram showing a thermocouple, so a little thermometer that he's using to measure. This bee is actually not dead. It's just anesthetized. It's just knocked out. And he's just measuring its body temperature with this little probe. And then we do have to take them back to the lab to measure their water content. So field body temperature and field water content. So now let's go back to this, and we can calculate something called a safety margin. And the safety margin is simply the difference between the body temperature we measured in the field and the limit, okay? So if in this situation, they have a really big safety margin, what I've shown here, right? But you could collect a bee that's over here, really close to their limits, and then it would have a very small safety margin. Same thing for over here for water content, right? If the bee is near their optimal hydration, then they have a really big safety margin for water. But we could collect a bee over here that's near its limit, okay? So it's the difference between the field body temperature and the maximums they can survive for the thermal safety margin or the difference between field water content and the minimum they can survive for their hydric or water content safety margin. So what were the results from Justin's work? First thing we saw is that there's variation in the bees. This is for their thermal safety margin. So some bees were closer to their limits and some bees were farther from their limits. In particular, bumblebees were farther away than honeybees, and honeybees were farther away than these sweat bees, and the sweat bees were closest to their thermal limit. However, I want to point something out. The lowest point on this y-axis for thermal safety margin is 24 degrees Celsius. So 0 is not on here. They are nowhere close to their limits in Toledo. So not close at all. So sort of to put it in context, here is their field body temperature in Toledo, right? There's their maximum, so they've got this really big safety margin. Here would be their optimum body temperature, right? At the top of this curve. So if you think about it, in this context, in Toledo, warming probably would help the bees a little bit, actually. So some warming might help the bees in Toledo. We did look across that gradient of impervious surface, right? To see like the hotter, more urbanized parts of the city, were they closer to their limits? And the answer was yes. For bumblebees and these sweat bees, we saw that they did get close to their limits with more urbanization in the city, but still not close in this case in Toledo. So I'm going to come back to this later. What about other cities, right? Might be a different story. Let's go to water first, though. Let's look at Justin's results for water. So this is the hydric safety margin. So this is percent water content close to how close they are to their limits, right? This is the safety margin. So I'm going to start with the sweat bees. Really not very close, except for maybe this one down here. Most of them, they were about 20 or 30 percentage points away from their water content limits. But let's put on the other two. This is a different story. So both bumblebees and honeybees were very close to their limits. Okay, that's the 0 line right there. Okay, very close, right on the edge of drying out, dehydrating to death, or desiccating to death. And when we looked across impervious surface for honeybees, we saw that they got even closer to their limit the more urbanized it was. So as it got hotter in the city, they dried out more, essentially, which might make some sense. You sweat more when it's hot, right? Okay. So what were the conclusions from Justin's work? First, none of the species were near their temperature limits. Honeybees and bumblebees were near their water content limits. Urban honeybees were close to their water content limits, and urban bumble and sweat bees were closer to their temperature limits, but not close, but closer. And honeybees in particular appeared to be at severe risk of dehydration in Toledo, in the urbanized parts of Toledo. Okay, so that was Toledo, right? It's not a particularly dry or hot place. So we then got some work, oh, hold on a second, pop up. We then got some some funded to do some additional work in other cities across the US. And so this is, again, the map of temperature and precipitation, but each one of these stars is a city where we worked. And so not just Toledo, but also Detroit near us, right? But then if we go out to Colorado, we've got Denver and Fort Collins, and we've got down in Arizona, Phoenix and Tucson, and then over in Georgia, Atlanta and Athens, and North Carolina, Raleigh and Durham. So lots of places around the US that we were looking. Got a lot of people to acknowledge on this, especially my collaborators, Elsa Youngstad at North Carolina State University, Clint Pennick at Auburn, lots of techs and students that were really instrumental in making this work happen. I also want to thank the inhabitants and caretakers of the lands on which we work, right? From indigenous to peoples who are often forcibly displaced, to current peoples of diverse backgrounds and ethnicities who really care deeply for these spaces and often rely on them for sustenance and livelihoods. We saw that very much when we were working in these places, how much people cared about these gardens. We strive to do research that supports these communities and helps them. So what was our overall goal of this research? It's partly about looking at the safety margins again. It's a complex diagram, you don't have to look at it in full. But we also were trying to look at other things. So not just safety margins, but health of the bees, abundance of the bees, and pollination. So actually, how much pollination were they able to do? So we're still working on some of this, but I'm going to share some preliminary results. So I'm going to start with thermal safety margin. So we talked about this a lot already, so don't be intimidated by this graph, and I'll take you through it, okay? So first of all, on the x-axis down here is our thermal safety margin, right? There's the 0, right, up to about 30. So if there's a bee near this 0 line, then that means it's right on the edge of its thermal limit. It's on the edge of overheating to death, right? But if it's over here at like 20 degrees Celsius, then it's nowhere near its limit, and it might even be near its optimal, right? Or maybe even 10 or 15 might be near its optimal. I'm going to take you through that with some boxes in a minute. Over on the y-axis is region. So we've got Michigan and Ohio, Georgia, North Carolina, Arizona, and Colorado. And then each of these plots is a different taxon of bees. So here's Agapostamon, that's a little sweat bee, that little green, beautiful sweat bee that we talked about before. Here's some honeybees. This is another little sweat bee. Bombus is the bumblebees. Ceratina are those little tiny carpenter bees. Eucerine bees are those longhorned bees. Halictus are another kind of sweat bee. Lasioglossum is another kind of sweat bee. Megachile, those are the leafcutter bees. Pepinapis, those are the squash bees. Savastra are another kind of longhorn bee. And Xylocopa are those really big carpenter bees. So that kind of gives you an overview of what we're talking about here. Okay, so I'm going to put up some green boxes. This is kind of where the bees are safe, right? No problem. This is kind of a good zone for the bees. They're probably near their optimal conditions. And so you can see that most of the bees in most places are actually in that zone. So that's kind of good news. But I'm going to point out a few things. First thing I'm going to point out is Michigan, Ohio. Again, if we look at all these graphs, these green bars are sort of the least at risk. So that kind of confirms what we saw before in the other study, but now for more bees, more species of bees. So in Toledo, really not at risk of overheating. However, I'm going to make some red circles on here. These are the bees that are really close to overheating. And so one thing you can notice is Arizona bees, not surprisingly, are close to their limits. So, there's some more work we need to do here to see if they can adjust their limits, but other research that's been done suggests that bees actually can't really adjust their limits very much. It's hard for them to evolve limits at the upper end. So it's harder for them. There's kind of temperatures at which not much life can survive, right? And so we're sort of getting to some of those conditions at certain times in Arizona. But that's sort of a way to think about it with a bunch of different species. Also want to point out this, bumblebees, okay? Remember I mentioned bumblebees are sort of well known to be particularly sensitive to climate change. Well, we're seeing that. They're actually not even found in the cities in Arizona where we're doing the work, maybe because it's too hot for them. But you can see in Georgia, North Carolina, and Colorado, there's a bunch of bees that are really close to their limits. So that's kind of the take home of these thermal safety margin early results of this work. Oh, forgot to animate this appropriately, but water safety margins. I want to give you some background about that. We are still getting the data. So we're not going to, I'm not going to show you full results today, but I'm going to give you some early results. One of them that is shown in this graph is the bees around the US get dehydrated at higher temperatures. So we are seeing that. When it gets hotter, bees, you might think, oh, well, maybe they're just able to go hide in the shade, or they're able to go drink some more nectar, and so they don't dry out. But that's actually not the pattern we're seeing. We're seeing as they get higher body temperatures, their water content goes down. And this isn't true for every single species of bee that we've studied, but for about half of them at least, maybe even more, they get dehydrated when it gets hotter. So this is bumblebees here. Some bees of many taxa are actually close to their limits in most regions at certain times and locations. So I'm not going to show you full data on that because it's a little complicated, but I'm going to go show the bumblebees again. So these bumblebees here, what I want to point out to you is the zero line, okay? So this is bees that are near the zero line are very close to their limits. And you can see that the water content safety margins in Colorado, Georgia, North Carolina, and Michigan and Ohio, they're all pretty, like they all have a good number of bees that are close to their limits. Even if most of them are a little bit farther away, still not very far. And then there's a bunch of bees that are really close to dying due to dehydration. So just to kind of give you an overall summary of everything I've talked about, bees are generally not at risk of overheating in our region, in Toledo or even Michigan, but they are in other cities, right? And so that's really important to know. There are some important pollinators like bumblebees and honeybees that may become dehydrated in our region as well. So there is a risk there even in our region. But the risks are even greater in other cities in general. So some taxa of bees are at greater risk than others too, when you look at the data we have so far from both temperature and water. Bumblebees in particular, but also leafcutter bees seem to be particularly sensitive. And Halictus and Lasioglossum sweat bees, which are very common, very abundant sweat bees, do a lot of pollination. So that's a little concerning. So finally, I want to talk a little bit about what can be done to help protect bees and ensure pollination. Good message for this group. We actually did some research on this topic, and at least in Toledo, we found that declines of bees in more urbanized parts of Toledo could actually be completely reversed by adding more flowering plants, and especially purple ones. Okay, I don't know why purple, so that's kind of an interesting observation. But yeah, I mean, I think that the work that this group promotes is really a big part of this picture of how we can help the bees. There may be some other ways too. So we could supplement water or add shade for urban bees. In particular, in Toledo, that might not be necessary, right? Looking at our data, you may not need to add shade in Toledo. But supplementing water could be a way to do it. As some people probably already aware, it's a good idea to put some gravel in the water so they don't drown, but you could add some water. And another thing is provide nesting habitat with different sun exposure. So we haven't done research on this, but others in other locations have shown that certain species of bees, like certain leafcutters, actually choose their nest sun exposure based on the regional climate. So like in Toledo, they might choose to make their nests in a place that is more exposed to the sun. But in Phoenix or Tucson, they would probably choose shadier locations to make their nests. So just kind of a cool observation that might give us some important management information. And that's it. Thanks for inviting me, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
If anyone has questions, they can be posted in the chat, and we will pass them along to Kevin. Or pipe up. I'm sure we can entertain that. Well, while people are scratching their heads on questions, I have like one kind of silly question. How do they use drones to pollinate crops? That seems insane to me, because you're going to shred the flowers and you're going to shred the bees that are nearby.
I haven't looked into that in depth. It does seem like a strange approach, but apparently they're doing it. I don't really know. Maybe it's a situation where they're collecting the pollen separately and then they're using the drones to spread the pollen. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. Brushes?
What a great project to look into.
Yeah.
We do have a question that popped up in the chat.
Okay.
How do you actually measure the hydration? Do you have to kill the bees?
Yeah, so we do. We anesthetize the bees first, and then we freeze them, which I think is a pretty humane way for these particular groups of organisms. because they are what we call ectotherms. So they get their heat externally from the environment. And when it gets cold, they just go to sleep. And you can even sometimes on a cold morning in the summer find a bee and it's just like completely asleep. It can't really move. It can't really move around because it's too cold. So it's probably the most humane way because it's a very natural thing for them.
Another question popped up. You mentioned Western honeybees. Are these European honeybees or a different species?
Yeah, these are European honeybees. Yeah, all the honeybees in the United States are European honeybees. Oh, back to the other question. I just want to make a quick note, though. We are removing a very small percentage of the bees when we take these individuals. Like we've done calculations, and it's like, probably not even close to 10% of the bees at a garden. Probably much less than that. It's a very small number. We might take like 5 bees from a particular garden for our research. And our estimates, there's probably about 200 of every particular species, each species there.
More questions, anybody? Well, I know you've only got preliminary results in some cases here, but it seems rather curious that some bees are unhappy and approaching their limits and others not. And which species are affected also doesn't seem to follow any intelligible pattern in terms of body size or anything like that. Is there particular data that you are still analyzing that might be used to tease these issues apart?
Yeah, so some colleagues have started finding some differences between the sexes. So that's one of the things we want to explore. Right now, our data are grouped. And in fact, the data I presented today includes multiple species within some of those taxa that I mentioned. So we want to drill down to the species level, and we want to drill into the sexes as well and see which ones, if there are particular ones that are more sensitive than others. But what you say is a really good observation, because we suspected that there would be a strong relationship with body size and risk of drying out, and we don't really see that pattern. There's some interesting things that we do see, like it seems like larger bees maintain narrower safety margins and smaller bees maintain bigger ones, which you might expect because smaller bees are, the rate of evaporation from their bodies is larger relative to their body size, as something called surface area to volume ratios. And so the smaller bees, they have a much higher surface area to their volume ratio. So you might think that if you're a small bee, you want to maintain a larger safety margin just in case. But then we have some other weird observations. So for instance, we can also look at how long it takes them to dry out, right? And the Xylocopa, the really big carpenter bees, and the Ceratina, the teeny tiny carpenter bees, they are both very resistant to drying out. So they can survive really long time in these desiccating conditions. And that's not what you would expect based on surface area to volume ratios. So I think there's other things going on. I could get really nerdy about this. I think part of it probably has to do with something called cuticular hydrocarbons. It's basically how the bees waterproof themselves. It's sort of a waxy covering on the outside of the bee. And so I think that probably explains a good amount of this. So these are things we want to look into for the future.
Another question regarding your experimental design. What was the purpose for pairing cities?
Yeah, great question. I will admit that part of it was logistical. So we had originally sort of proposed to do some work at just like 4 cities across the US. And reviewers rightly pointed out that we needed more cities. And so we thought, okay, how can we do this? How can we get more cities without spending massive amounts of more money to try to go to all these cities and collect bees at all of these cities and do our research? And we realized, well, okay, if we do paired cities that are driving distance from each other, we could just fly into one location and drive from one city to the next and get two cities that way. So that was the big motivation for the paired cities, quite truthfully.
Another interesting question just popped up. We have heard that bumblebees originated from cooler northern regions. Might the origin be connected to the results and phylogenetic signal kind of thing?
Yeah, and that's actually an interesting pattern for most bees, is that they are believed to sort of evolved in the temperate regions, and they tend to be more diverse in those temperate regions, which is a different pattern than you see with a lot of other taxa where they're more diverse in the tropics. You don't see that with the bees, not to the same extent anyway. And so I do think that's a good observation. It could be that where they evolved, there's some previous phylogenetic constraints on their sort of ability to tolerate these hotter temperatures or drier conditions. Although bee diversity actually gets really high in dry areas, so that part doesn't really follow that pattern, but the temperature part of it does follow that pattern.
Cool. Any more questions for Kevin? Is this project coming sort of to a wrap up, or is there a follow-up set of questions that you're going to be pursuing?
Yeah, so it's sort of coming to I guess, an intermediate point. So we have collected 3 years worth of data from these locations, or samples, I should say. And we've got some additional work to do to kind of do the data analysis and writing, but we have lots of additional questions. And so, yeah, we're definitely hoping to get more funding to continue doing this work and trying to better understand, how can we help the bees in these locations where they're more at risk.
A lot of people saying thank you in the chat currently. Fascinating work. I want to have a personal conversation with you about your purple plants.
I'm sure you will. Thanks for inviting me.
Great work. Looking forward to hearing the next update on this work.
Awesome.